so that Vinny, we record these so that we can have them they're uploaded to our YouTube channel.
Fantastic.
Um, so anyway, you have the floor, sir.
Alrighty. Well, thanks, Ken, for the introduction and for hosting us, and all the folks tuning in from Yolo Audubon or wherever you're associated but joining us virtually. I'm going to share my screen, if that's all right. These are always more fun in person, but the commute is definitely easier tonight, I will say that. Is that looking good full screen? Y'all can see that?
It looks good on my computer here, yes.
Alrighty. So I'm Benny, and tonight's presentation is on the magic of Central America, focusing specifically on Costa Rica's birds and ecology. I'm Benny Jacob Schwartz, and I will be your host for this evening. And I'd like to start all my presentations off kind of a little bit general, and then zoom into some more kind of specifics, talk about ecology, and then go into some case studies, talk about species, etc. And tonight is going to be no different. And so a little background about myself. I do a couple different things with my business called Birds by Beaches. I do bird and ecology walks, mostly in Southern California. I started kind of producing some clothing to get people excited about birding, because when I first started birding, I was the youngest person on most walks by a long shot, and I thought that was a shame because birds are amazing and other people and my peers should get excited about it. And so I wanted to create kind of more fashion forward birding accessories and gear to get people kind of lured and asking me questions about it, rather than me just trying to, like, you know, explain to them why I'm so excited about birds. So that was one of my approaches to kind of bridging the gap between my peers and birds. And now my business also has opened up to running international birding tours. And so here's a couple of tours that I have going on next year. I had a Costa Rica one and Ecuador one that have sold out. And then I have another one in Ecuador because there was a lot of interest, with the Amazon extension, and then an incredible 12 days in Colombia. So that's basically what I do. And give awesome talks like this and spend a lot of time in nature. But who doesn't that likes birds? So tonight we are heading to not the African continent, but to Central America, and more specifically to Costa Rica. So this is an aerial map of Costa Rica, like satellite view, and I'll point out a couple of kind of the main topographic features. One of the first ones that I'll point out is the Osa Peninsula. This is a large peninsula, and then on the northwest is the Nicoya Peninsula. And as you can see, Costa Rica is crazy green. There's a variety of different mountain ranges, and it's sandwiched between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. And a little bit about Costa Rica from a Spark Notes perspective, so we can talk a little bit generally first. So Costa Rica is really small. It's a bit smaller than West Virginia. They love to compare Central American countries to small US states, as if anyone truly knows what that means. But as an educator, it's important to provide a little bit of context. So if there's any folks who have been to West Virginia or know the general size of West Virginia, that is about how big Costa Rica is. And Costa Rica's been basically an independent country since 1821, which is really cool. It's got a population of around 5 million people and a super high literacy rate. And I think also something that's important to point out is that ecotourism is a huge part of Costa Rican economy and modern day culture. And it equates for about 11% of the country's total GDP. And a couple of reasons why I shared the literacy rate and the date of independence is that Costa Rica has been its own sovereign nation for quite some time. And in the 1940s, in the early 40s, it basically abolished its army. And so it was able to allocate a lot of financial resources to education, to the healthcare system, and different things. And so Costa Rica has one of the highest literacy rates of any country in Central America. And Costa Rica has rightfully earned a pretty green reputation. Ecotourism has been booming in the country pretty significantly in the last 20 years, but it's been been present in good force since about the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. And when it comes to land conservation, about 25% of the entire country is protected, which is really cool. So if you can imagine what 25% of West Virginia looks like, now you can imagine what percentage of Costa Rica is protected. And it's protected in a couple different ways. There's about 28 national parks. There's 58 designated wildlife refuges. There's 32 protected zones, which include marine protected areas off the coasts. There's 15 wetland and mangrove protected areas. And then there are 11 private forest reserves. So we're going to look back at Costa Rica a little bit more. And this is a topographic map, not on satellite modes. You can see a little bit more of the topo relief here. So like I said, it's sandwiched between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. And these are some of the main factors that influence distribution of certain species in Costa Rica. A lot of the species are either like Caribbean in distribution or Pacific in distribution. So that's one thing to note. And then, like I said, there's mountain ranges that basically divide the country down the middle. And so in the southeastern part of the country, we have the Talamanca Mountains, which host a lot of regional or near endemic species, because the Talamanca Mountains extend into extreme western Panama. And so there's species that are only found in the Talamanca Mountains, which is, like I said, Costa Rica and extreme western Panama. And then there's like the Central Valley here where San Jose, the city capital, is. And then basically to the northwest, there's the Central Mountains, but it's basically a chain of volcanoes like Volcan Irasu, Volcan Poás, and a couple others. And then as we move our way farther into the northwest, there's the Guanacaste Mountains, which, believe it or not, are predominantly volcanoes. There's a couple famous ones up here, including Rincon de la Vieja, which is a national park. And this area is interesting. There's a lot of Caribbean influence in this area in particular, even though it's quite far from the Caribbean, but most of this area is all lowlands. This is all Caribbean lowlands. And so you can still be in the northwest part of the country experiencing some of the Caribbean, the ecological kind of components of the Caribbean lowlands. And for anyone who spent time in the Caribbean, the lowlands are hot and humid, but they have some extremely colorful birds. And the Caribbean slope basically goes all the way up into the east side or the Caribbean side of these mountains. And so you could be on one mountain, for example, or one mountain range, and you could be on the Pacific side. And then you get up to kind of the peak of the mountain. And then on the backside, it has Caribbean influence. So it's really interesting here. And then basically this whole region of the country, basically up through kind of this central portion of the coast, this is all Pacific dry forest. This is all deciduous dry forest and made up of a whole different composition of species of plants and animals. And it's generally quite dry during the non-rainy season and pretty lush and vibrant during the rainy season. And then the rest of the country is pretty much green year-round. So here's a little bit more of a zoomed in look at Costa Rica's diverse topography. And so we can take a look at the elevational key here. 11, the white makes sense, snow, but the highest elevations in the country, and 0 is sea level. Like I said, this kind of Nicoya Peninsula, this whole bay in here is quite low. This is a lot of wetland habitat in here. And one thing that's interesting about Costa Rica is that it has a diversity of habitats just like California, right? California has its own California floristic province. We have thousands of endemic plant species and other animals that are found nowhere else on Earth. And so traveling between Costa Rica and California is quite interesting because it's such a small country, but it takes a lot to see different species, which kind of feels like birding in North America. Like if you want to get into the upper numbers, you have to really travel quite far. And so the highest elevation, there's a ecosystem type called paramo, and it's basically tropical alpine, and it's most commonly found in the Andes, but there is small bits of paramo habitat in Costa Rica, which host a couple unique species like volcano junco. And this is also a cool way to view Costa Rica's diversity in terms of what are defined as Holdridge's life zones. So there's all these different types of life zones, and life zones are basically determined through this pyramid of abiotic factors, which is basically elevation, rainfall, and temperature. So depending on where the places lie within that pyramid, they're deemed different life zones. And so, like I said, this orange area is basically tropical dry forest. And to the most extreme, we have like these purple areas, tropical pre-montane wet forest or cloud forest. And it gets even higher up into this blue and this like kind of pinkish purple color. But we're not going to spend too much time on that. So for a couple more spark notes, so Costa Rica estimates say that it's home to approximately 5% of global biodiversity, which is pretty astonishing and kind of a fact that people throw around quite a bit about Costa Rica, but it shouldn't be underestimated because there's approximately 900 species of birds from 82 families that have been observed in Costa Rica. There's about 225 species of reptiles, 215 species of amphibians, and there's to this date about 35,000 species of insects that have been described, and 9,000 species of flowering plants, and 1,900 species of trees. So I'm not going to let that sink in too much, but I think the numbers speak for themselves. Costa Rica has a lot to offer, regardless of what taxa you're interested in. Another thing that people talk a lot about is when is the best time to go to Costa Rica? And a lot of people say the dry season. And it's true in terms of rainfall. There's definitely the least amount of rainfall in the dry season, which generally occurs between mid-November and April. But the rainy season is actually my favorite time of year in Costa Rica because growing up in Southern California, rain is kind of something that's few and far between. And the rainy season is just spectacular. It's also really great for photography because the days have generally flatter lighting. And the best part is that it generally doesn't rain in the mornings, and then you get the whole morning to bird and do your thing. And then by late afternoon or midday, the thunder and lightning sometimes, and definitely rain rolls in. So that's basically kind of how seasonality is punctuated in Costa Rica. Obviously, with climate change, these seasons aren't as distinct as they once were, but this is, for rough strokes, what seasonality looks like in Costa Rica. And another thing that I wanted to kind of talk about is habitat connectivity. So obviously we're in California, we're along the Pacific Flyway, and birds move both south and north along the Pacific Flyway. And as you can see, a lot of birds move through Central Americas. And it's important to understand that from a conservation standpoint, it's important to support other organizations that are doing work in places in the New World tropics, because this is only like when birds are in North America, it's only half or a third of the story, right? A lot of the shorebirds that breed in Alaska are only there for less than 2 months, and they spend the rest of the year outside of their breeding grounds. So just wanted to drive home that point because I think it's often left out in North American conservation conversations. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the species in Costa Rica. There are some that are more fascinating than others, and I'll let you decide that. However, we will be kind of proceeding from kind of a field guide taxonomic perspective. So we'll start with some of the water birds. So oftentimes when I'm in person, I'll ask people to guess what these birds are, if they can recognize the species. I'll let you think about that to yourself silently, since we're not doing that tonight. But if you were thinking least grebe, that's true. There aren't so many pie-billed grebes in Costa Rica. This is the most common grebe there. They're cute. They're special because we don't have them at home. And like I said, Costa Rica has a lot of different birds that pass through there, including shorebirds. And this is at a like a salt production facility is a strong word, but these are salt flats that are used for salt harvesting, and in the Pacific lowlands. And the last slide had a ton of western sandpipers. I'm sure folks can recognize the marble godwits and the willets in here. And here's everybody cruising around together. And one of my favorite shorebirds that I've observed in Costa Rica was my lifer, Wilson's plover, which was really exciting because it is quite difficult in general to find in the United States. Florida is kind of the best bet to look for it. And even still, you have to look for it. Costa Rica also has some stork species. So on our left, starting out with the smaller stork, this is a wood stork. And this is a gorgeous bird. This is a jabiru. These guys stand at like about 4 feet high, and they're common in northern wetlands in the country. And one of these birds is actually not a stork. It tried to sneak in here. This is a snowy egret. Alrighty, moving along into herons and ibises. We have a couple different ibises that you can see in Costa Rica. The white ibis is definitely one we have in the US, but not really in California. And the green ibis is definitely one that we don't have in the United States. These guys are really cool, gorgeous birds seen around kind of lowland Caribbean um, rivers and streams. And then, of course, the roseate spoonbill. I can't get enough of this bird. We've got tricolored herons and one of the most charismatic herons, the boat-billed heron. These guys have these are kind of like the new world shoebill, so to speak. They've got a really wide bill and they kind of hang out in groups in mangroves. And this is one of our awesome targets that we look for on my Central Shore birding tour, where we go birding by boat up the Rio Tarcoles. And these guys are mostly nocturnal, looking for crabs. And one of the most famous herons in Costa Rica is hands down the agami heron. I would have provided this photo, but I have yet to see this species myself. But I hope to go see one when I go back in January. They are incredible. And this is a species that we target in northern Costa Rica. So getting into everyone's favorite challenging birds, rails and gallinules. Some of the rail species are really quite fascinating and handsome. This is the russet-naped wood rail. These guys cruise around kind of flooded forest floors and sometimes in mangrove habitats as well. They're quite charismatic looking. And crakes. These are species that I don't think we have in the US, but we obviously have rails. And these guys are super furtive in general. They are hard to spot and they have a really interesting sound, which I'll play for you right now because I really like it. So these guys
I'm
are
not
really
hearing.
common in
I'm not hearing it,
agricultural
Benny.
areas. Were you able to hear that?
I was not. Hopefully, some of the others
Oh,
were
okay.
able to hear it.
All right. Well, we'll move on. At any rate, they're really beautiful and they're cool. And we'll keep trucking then. So another bird that I was super excited to see in Costa Rica a couple of years ago was the sunbittern. And these guys kind of have similar kind of ecosystem preferences as our American dippers. They cruise around rivers looking for invertebrates and things like that and fish. But these guys do not submerge themselves in the water the way that northern or that American dippers do. And when they open their wings, they have this incredible sun pattern. And when I photographed this image, the lighting was really low. And so I was photographing it in the pose that it was in before where it was cruising around, and then it basically took off and I didn't have time to adjust my settings or anything like that, so I was shooting at a super slow shutter speed, and much to my surprise this image came out super beautiful. This is definitely one of my favorite pictures from Costa Rica. Alrighty, so there are a group of birds in Costa Rica called frugivores, or they are frugivorous. They eat fruits, and they're super important for trees like avocados and other ficus because they're seed dispersers. And so they eat the fruit, and then they eat the kind of non-seed part, the like husk and the meat or the flesh of the fruit. And then when they defecate, they disperse the seeds. And so we're going to talk about three more iconic frugivores in Costa Rica, and one of which is this black guan, which is found generally kind of in upper to high elevation forested habitats like cloud forest. Another charismatic bird in the, I forget what the name of the family is, but guans and curassows is basically the group of birds. And this is the great curassow. There's like a couple different morphs. There's like a barred morph, and then there's sexual dimorphism. And this is a barred morph. And these birds were generally quite rare to see before conservation efforts were really ramped up, because these birds, as one can assume, they're like turkeys and they're delicious, and so they were hunted pretty heavily, and so they were quite weary of people after that time. But now they're quite common in a lot of different places like La Selva, and other spots where they sometimes will come to feeders, and they walk around the grounds like kind of domestic birds, but they're totally wild. And getting into columbids or pigeons and doves and things like that, there's quite a few different doves and pigeons that you can see in Costa Rica. The Inca dove is quite common in the lowlands. I'm not going to spend too much time on doves because there's a lot of birds to cover. But quail doves, this is kind of a unique group of columbids that you can see in the tropics. Basically, when you hear quail dove, it just means beautiful pigeon that's hard to find. They often cruise along poorly lit forested trails, or cruise around kind of walking in the understory, looking for seeds and berries that have fallen to the ground, or seeds and fruit that's fallen to the ground, as well as insects. There's a variety of different quail dove species. So vultures, hawks, and allies. So the black vulture is ubiquitous in Costa Rica. And if you spent much time basically Mexico or south, you've probably seen a lot of black vultures. But I wanted to capture a photo that, or share a photo that puts vultures in potentially a different category with folks, because I think a lot of people don't feel great about vultures, but they are obviously super important to the ecosystem because they consume dead animals rapidly before disease and things like that can spread. And one of the most beautiful and massive vultures in Costa Rica is the king vulture. This is a gorgeous bird, white and black with super colorful head. And there's some spots in Costa Rica where you can actually photograph them at behind a hide, where they put down a pig head, and you can see dozens and dozens of vultures, and sometimes up to 10 or 15 king vultures come down to feed. Double-toothed kite, this is a small accipiter in a forest accipiter, kind of a perch and dive type predator. Greyhawk is quite common in the Pacific lowlands as well. Common blackhawk, this is widespread in the Pacific lowlands, also found in mangrove habitats. Beautiful raptor. This is the great blackhawk. This is a larger version of the common blackhawk. These are all predatory birds. And one of the most charismatic raptors, I think probably one of the top 5 charismatic raptors in Costa Rica, is the white hawk. This is an adult bird photographed outside of Monteverde, and they're super fascinating. They have an association with white-faced capuchin monkeys, and they'll basically follow a troop of capuchin monkeys around, because these are small monkeys that travel in groups, and they generally are omnivorous, and they eat a lot of insects and things like that. And so as they're cruising around through the forest, they inevitably stir up resting bugs and invertebrates and things like that. And so the white hawks wake hunt, or kind of associate with the capuchin monkeys, and feed on insects and invertebrates that have been stirred up by the monkeys. So sometimes people say, if you're looking for white hawks, keep your eyes peeled for troops of white-faced capuchin monkeys in the right habitat, because sometimes you can spot them together. And I was lucky enough to have that happen to me twice, once on the Osa Peninsula and once in Rincon de la Vieja. And one of the top 5 most charismatic raptors is for sure the ornate hawk eagle. This picture was taken from pretty far away, but as you can see, this is an adult ornate hawk eagle with its beautiful black crest and orange eye and just super dramatic colors. And this is its little baby in the nest. And if you look off to the right, you can see it's got a little bit of food waiting for it. Here's a slightly different look at the ornate hawk eagle. Again, this is from a bit of a distance, but you can see how massive their feet are in comparison to their body. And just an incredible bird, just absolutely breathtaking. Chrysocaracara is a common species in Costa Rica in the lowlands, and they're actually a member of the falcon family, but their behavior is much more similar to that of vultures, where they scavenge for roadkill and carrion. So there are a lot of owls to see in Costa Rica. Some of them are more challenging than others. The ferruginous pygmy owl is probably the most common owl in the lowlands. This is a diurnal species for the most part, and you can hear it oftentimes during the daytime. And these are not too dissimilar than our northern pygmy owl or our small owls that we have here, excuse me, in North America. They're omnivore, or they're carnivorous, feeding on a bunch of different invertebrates, small songbirds, lizards, things like that. Basically, whatever it can catch. And another beautiful, adorable little owl of the Pacific side is the Pacific screech owl. This was photographed during the daytime. We were coming back from a morning birding session, gonna have some food, and we're standing outside, and a pair of Pacific screech owls flew in and landed in a palm tree. And so you can see kind of the ridges or the serrations here. This is like the background is a palm leaf, and we just checked out the bird for a little bit and then let it rest in peace. So getting to some more kind of typically diurnal owls that you can see in Costa Rica. On the top left, we have the bare-shanked screech owl, which is quite small and kind of more of an upland species. And then on the bottom left, we have the crested owl. This is a really beautiful bird. And on the right is the spectacled owl. So there's a group of birds that are pretty similar in terms of their appearance to nightjars or Caprimulgidae, which we have here in North America, lesser nighthawk, common poor-will, etc. And the potus are really interesting. Oops. And they're really cryptic. As you can see, their plumage has incredible camouflage. And there's 3 different potu species in Costa Rica: the gray potu, the northern potu, and the common potu. And they're all basically very similar. And a fascinating thing about the potu is that they rest in what's called a cryptic pose during the daytime. Not in all cases. This one's perched on just like a tree branch chilling, but they'll often perch on snags where at the top of the snag where basically a vertical tree trunk has snapped in half, and they'll sit perched on the top of the tree trunk, and then they will basically cock their head all the way up and then they'll just kind of sleep like that. And they basically like look for posts that have kind of like that aren't clean, like a chainsaw. And so they'll sit like that with their head up in what's called the cryptic pose, and they blend in so well. You have to like really intentionally scan the snags looking to see if you can find them, or sometimes they perch in the same place over and over again, so you can kind of return to those areas to look for them. But these are really cool birds that you can look for at night using detection of your ears to hear them, or you can look for them during the daytime. Alrighty, everybody's favorite group, or just mine, hummingbirds. There's about 51 different species of hummingbirds in Costa Rica, and let's get into some of them. So this is the white-throated mountain gem. This is a male. This is maybe one of my all-time favorite Costa Rica hummers. And this was photographed in the Talamanca Mountains, which is one of the places that we'll be going on my Central Sur tour. And they are absolutely breathtaking. There's a couple different mountain gem species. There's white-throated, white-bellied, as well as the purple-throated mountain gem. And this is in the Tilarán Mountains in Monteverde near my house where I photographed this. And then down on the bottom left corner, we have the largest hummingbird in Costa Rica. This is the violet saberwing. They're typically the most aggressive of hummingbirds, but the rufous-tailed hummingbird on our right here, it gives them a run for their money. Both these birds often displace other hummingbirds when they come to feeders or flowers. And the rufous-tailed hummingbird is probably the most ubiquitous bird in the country. And after you spend some time in Costa Rica, when you first get to Costa Rica, you're like, wow, rufous-tailed hummingbird, so beautiful. And then you see them all over the place and you're slightly less excited, but they are nonetheless gorgeous. And another stunner from the Talamanca Highlands is the fiery-throated hummingbird or the rainbow-throated hummingbird. And these birds are really cool. And as you can see, they've kind of got a bicolored bill here, and they've got iridescent body feathers all the way through the breast and on the top of their head and the gorget. And these birds can kind of be tricky to photograph to get all the color to show because, like most hummingbirds, if they're not positioned in just the right way, the gorget won't reflect the light that's passing through the microscopic structures and the feather barbules. But these are unbelievably handsome birds, and we also get to see these on my tours. Alrighty, two of probably the most challenging to see hummingbirds in Costa Rica are these tiny little coquettes. On the left, we have a black crested coquette, and probably the best spot to see this is at the Arnall Observatory Lodge, but it's by no means common, and the white crested coquette is also a very challenging bird to find. Oftentimes, people see females of these species more, but most people want to see the males for good reason. Alrighty, getting into some more hummers because there's 51 and we're not going to go through all of them, but we're definitely going to look at some. So this is the copper-headed emerald. This is actually a true endemic to Costa Rica. Costa Rica doesn't have so many true endemics. A lot of them are shared, like I said, between the Talamanca Mountains in Panama. And then here's a lesser violet ear. This is also quite a common species in Costa Rica, but really beautiful. Here's the white-necked Jacobin, and you can see its namesake, a little bit of white in the neck. And then the snowcap is generally the top of most people's hummingbird want lists when they go to Costa Rica, and they can sometimes be challenging to see, but there are definitely some good, reliable places to look for snowcaps. Alrighty, Apotidae or the swift family. There's a lot of different swifts in Costa Rica, most of which are very challenging to photograph and to identify. I've just included a couple common ones. The white-collared swift is a large swift that you can see throughout much of the country. And as their name suggests, they have a white collar. They're quite large. They're probably kind of similar in size to our white-throated swifts here. And then Vos swift or Vox's swift is also quite common. There's a ton of different swifts. They're hard to identify. One trick for swift watching is to photograph them on a cloudy day, because oftentimes when the clouds roll in, it pushes the insects lower and the swifts follow them down low. And so you can kind of adjust your camera settings to get a lot of light on your subject. And then, you know, if you're there during the, like when it starts raining, you can have a coffee and zoom in on your pictures to try and see if you can look for any discernible field marks on the swifts, because they are very tricky birds to ID. Alrighty, cuckoos. These are fun birds. We have a couple different species of cuckoos: groove-billed Ani, striped cuckoo, and the squirrel cuckoo is probably the most common cuckoo. And one of the holy grail birds in Costa Rica that is still eluding me, although I haven't put in a ton of effort to look for it, is the rufous-vented ground cuckoo. Now, these are basically tropical roadrunners. They're very similar in size. They're kind of similar in the way that they feed. They'll kind of run up and grab something and move back, except for the rufous-vented ground cuckoos follow army ant swarms. So army ants are a type of ant, a group of ants. There's many different species of army ants, and they're nomadic carnivorous colonial species that travel in groups of millions at a time, and they're all controlled by a single queen. And as they make their way through the forest, they stir up, they hunt insects and mammals and basically frogs, crickets, whatever, anything that gets caught in their path, they'll take down. And so as insects and invertebrates and things like that flee the scene, the rufous-vented ground cuckoo is there to scoop up what is trying to get away. And there's a whole group of birds called antbirds that we'll look at in a little bit. So here you can see this rufous-vented ground cuckoo is doing just that. And they are just stunning birds. They've got kind of a maroon tail fading into this blue iridescence, kind of this gunmetal blue in the kind of top of their crest. And they're just stunning, stunning birds that I hope to see soon. Alrighty, getting into parrots and parakeets. There are, I believe, 17 parrots and parakeet species in Costa Rica. as one would assume, certain species are found in certain areas and have specific ranges, which makes it all the more fun to travel around looking for different species. So this is a white-fronted parrot, and we have some crimson-fronted parakeets, great green macaws, which were kind of on the like were experiencing pretty significant declines in their population, but local conservation efforts have been able to revive their population, and they're making a really strong comeback. And they are much more common now in Costa Rica than they were in the past. Red Lord parrot is quite common as well. Yellow nape parrot is relatively common. And some of these parrots, like the yellow nape parrot, are listed as sensitive species because of the cage bird trade and animal trafficking that happens in tropical places with parrots. Here's a brown-hooded parrot. This is probably the most kind of iconic bird you see on social media feeds from photographers at fruit feeders, because brown-hooded parrots are gorgeous, and they're one of the few parrots that come down to feeders. My personal favorite is the scarlet macaw. These are relatively common in the Pacific lowlands near mangrove habitat, as well as kind of sandy beaches with beach almond. And they also kind of go up into the Pacific foothills as well. Alrighty, trogons and quetzals. So trogons are really cool. They're in the quetzal family, and they are globally distributed, which I find fascinating. Before continental drift, the entire globe was essentially connected. And so there's a variety of different bird families like trogons and barbets, which are actually distributed globally, as opposed to some species in the New World tropics, which are only found in the Western Hemisphere and specifically in certain tropical areas. And so, as you can see, the trogons basically have a very similar look in terms of their kind of morphology. But as you can see, they have differences in plumage. And a couple key things when you're identifying trogons, some of them look similar, is the orbital skin color, as well as the color of the belly. And then, as you can see, the undersides of the tails have different patternings. So those are things to keep in mind when we're looking at different trogons. And probably the most famous of all trogons is the resplendent quetzal. Although it is technically the national bird of Guatemala, its relative abundance is higher in Costa Rica. And this is an adult male. And these birds take about 7 years to reach their adult plumage. And some people come to Costa Rica just to see the resplendent quetzal. And with that in mind, I designed my tour to make sure that we go see quetzals. And these guys are the second of the four frugivores that we're going to talk about, and they're important seed dispersers. And these guys breed in lower cloud forest and upper cloud forest habitats, and they feed on aguacatillos. And there's something like, I don't know, like 60 or 70 different species of avocado just in Monteverde alone. And there's one species called Ocotea monteverdensis, which is kind of like a super producer of avocados, small little avocados that these guys can consume, except for they only fruit in kind of cycles of about every 3 years. But when they do, it's kind of a feeding frenzy. And the relative abundance of these other frugivores, including two more that we'll talk about in a little bit, is basically they're like, how many there are, for example, in Monteverde, that year depends on often how prolific a crop the Ocotea monteverdensis crop is. And they're fascinating. Sometimes they're challenging to see, but if you get to the right place, i.e. a fruiting fig tree during the right time of year, you stand a pretty good chance to see resplendent quetzals. And these guys are basically the two best spots to see them are in the Tiburon Mountains, like in Monteverde, or in the Talamanca Mountains in like Rio Savegre or Savegre Valley area. Here's one more look, because who doesn't want one more look? All right, getting into kingfishers. There's, I believe, 5 or 6 different species of kingfishers in Costa Rica. These 3 are the most challenging to identify because they're green and orange. On the top left, we have an American pygmy kingfisher. On the bottom left, we've got a green kingfisher. And on the right, we have the green and rufous kingfisher. These birds are present in pretty much anywhere where there's fish, mangroves, wetlands, rivers, streams, things like that. Now, this is the puffbirds and jacamars. So jacamars, like this rufous-tailed jacamar, are kind of a mix in terms of like shape and behavior of a hummingbird and a flycatcher. These guys often sit kind of in light gaps in the forest or along forest edges where they perch quietly and sally out and basically fly catch. And their preferred food source are actually butterflies. Here's a lanceolated monklet. These guys are quite challenging to see in Costa Rica. They're extremely quiet and very, very small. This was actually photographed in the Ecuadorian Amazon from a observation tower, which is why I was able to get a downward angle on this guy. Here's another one. This is a white-fronted nunbird, and these birds nest in like banks, like river banks and things like that, in clay. And this guy was digging out, like excavating a nest cavity when I photographed it. So getting into some motmots, there's quite a few different motmot species in Costa Rica. Keel-billed motmots of like kind of the northwest lowlands, and the turquoise brown motmot is kind of more Pacific lowlands in general. And these birds are very quiet but very colorful. They often are hard to photograph well because they don't always sit out in the open sunlight. They often kind of hang out along forest edges and in the shade of the forest, but they're kind of distributed all throughout the country. Each species kind of has its own distinct range. Here's a broad-billed barbet. These guys are motmot. These guys also are cavity nesters in banks. And here's the Lessons motmot. This is kind of the most widespread motmot in the country. Now getting into some barbets and toucans. So there's a couple different barbets in Costa Rica. One is the red-headed barbet. And this, as you guys can see, is a dimorphic species, meaning that the males and females are different. And the red-headed barbet is widespread throughout the New World tropics, but the prong-billed barbet has a much smaller range. And these guys are kind of more shyer denizens of cloud forest habitat, and oftentimes juveniles will cruise around in kind of medium-sized groups together, foraging. Toucans. So there's, believe it or not, several different species of toucans and toucanettes in Costa Rica. This is the northern emerald toucanet, or tucancillo verde. There's a couple before they were subspecies, and now supposedly maybe they even still are subspecies, but there's a northern and a southern emerald toucanet, but the southern isn't in Costa Rica. And here's the keel-billed toucan. This is probably one of the most famous birds in the world for Fruit Loops reasons, and I never get tired of seeing keel-billed toucans. And if you've been to Costa Rica, I'm sure you didn't either. And here's a yellow-throated toucan. And so there's toucanettes, toucans, and arasaris. And arasaris are also really cool and beautiful. And they often travel in groups of, 6 to 12 individuals. And all of the toucans are extremely omnivorous. They feed on a variety of different things, everything from bird eggs to baby birds to fruit to lizards to like amphibians, basically anything that they can fit in their mouth. Let's see if I have one more after. Yes. So one thing that was found out recently about toucan bills is that their beaks are actually super important for thermoregulation. And just like an elephant's ears have a very high surface to volume ratio, and they have a lot of small blood vessels that go out through the ears to allow the elephants to cool in the hot African environments. Arasaris, toucans, toucanettes also are able to thermoregulate because their beaks are actually like alive. They grow, and they're composed of this like super lightweight but dense kind of foam material. It's not literally foam, but when you look at a cross section on a microscope, that's kind of what it looks like. And they also have capillaries, like very thin blood vessels that travel throughout the beak. And so on a hot day, the bird can actually cool itself off through its beak. The beak is also super lightweight. It's keratinous, made of the same kind of things that our fingernails and our hair, I believe, are made out of. So it also allows the bird to kind of reach out on the end of a branch and grab a fruit and eat it. And the thermoregulative properties of these bills are so effective that supposedly they're 8 times more effective in cooling than elephant ears. And one of my my latest lifer from Costa Rica was the yellow-eared toucanet. This had been on my desperately need to see list for a long time. But unlike the other toucans, this bird is kind of more roaming and wandering within its range, and it's far more infrequently observed than any of the other toucan species, which is why it took me up until this year to see it. But as I'm sure you can imagine, I was very excited. Alrighty, woodpeckers. There's a lot of woodpeckers in Costa Rica. They come in different shapes and sizes. On the bottom, we have the olivaceous piculate. This is a group of woodpeckers that are the smallest woodpeckers in the world. Chestnut-colored woodpecker, black-cheeked woodpecker, kind of similar in size to our acorn woodpecker, pale-billed woodpecker, and another one called the lineated woodpecker. These are very similar in size to our pileated woodpecker. Did I? Yeah, I got lineated pileate mixed up. But yes, these are gorgeous, really cool, massive woodpeckers. All right, getting into some corvids. See how we're doing on time. All right. So we have a couple different corvid species in Costa Rica. The azure hooded jay is kind of a hard bird to see up in the cloud forest, but absolutely stunning. The white-throated magpie jay is relatively common, basically on the Pacific slope in kind of dry forest habitat and all the way up through kind of foothills. And wood creepers. I know I'm going fast as we haven't even gotten to tanagers yet, but wood creepers are a fascinating family of birds that we don't have in the United States. They're called furnarids, and they have kind of zygodactyl feet. And so they also have a stiff tail, and they basically hitch themselves on horizontal tree branches and oftentimes also on vertical trunks where they cruise around in tree trunks, cracks, crevices, and even forage in epiphytes like bromeliads and things like that, looking for all kinds of different invertebrates and insects. So there's a ton of different wood creepers in Costa Rica. They can be challenging to identify because they look relatively similar. And here's a couple wood creepers that were attending to an army ant swarm. So they were kind of just lurking on the sidelines, watching stuff go down and swooping in when the time was right to snag an insect. But as you can see, they're just absolutely stunning. And probably the most charismatic and recognizable but challenging to find wood creeper is the brown-billed scythebill with this really long bill. Just recently, I was in Colombia in May, and I saw a red-billed scythebill whose bill basically extends, if you can imagine, like all the way down here, and it is insane. Alrighty, ant birds. So I'm going to click through these kind of quick, but ant birds, believe it or not, are birds that follow ants. There's a ton of different ant type birds, ant following birds in this group. There's ant vireos, ant shrikes, ant tanagers, ant wrens, ant birds. They're all very cool. And they can be very challenging to photograph because they are cruising around on the forest floor where light is a limiting resource. Here's a male barred ant shrike, and here's probably the most gorgeous of the ant birds. This is the ocellated ant bird. Alrighty, cotingas. These are fantastically beautiful, and they're predominantly frugivorous, and they're generally kind of hard to see. There's 4 cotinga in Costa Rica, 2 of which that look white and 2 of which that have this turquoise color. There's the snowy cotinga and the yellow-billed cotinga, and then there's the turquoise cotinga and the lovely cotinga. Another cotinga is the bare-necked umbrella bird. This is kind of a ghost bird in Costa Rica. It's not as challenging to find as the rufous-vented ground cuckoo, but it's darn near close. And these are really beautiful birds, and this is a male, and kind of like the magnificent frigate birds in breeding, they puff up this kind of pouch here and make kind of a whoop, whoop, whoop sound to attract females, but they are very challenging to find. And I had my first one just a couple years ago. Here's another shot of these very handsome but kind of bizarre looking birds. Alrighty. Number three of important seed dispersers in Costa Rica is the three-wattled bellbird. So these are altitudinal migrants and they're cotingas. It takes them about 7 years, 6 or 7 years to reach this plumage, and these birds can live longer than, I believe, 20 years. They are kind of poorly studied in some aspects of their life history. It was only up until like a handful of years ago that the first three-wattled bellbird nest was discovered. And these birds are altitudinal migrants, and they spend the non-breeding season in the mangroves on the Pacific slope, and they spend the breeding season in the cloud forest almost exclusively in the Monteverde area. And as you can see in the background, there's a lot of these kind of aguacatillos, or drupe is like, a botanical term for a type of fruit. But regardless, these birds have the loudest call of, I believe, any bird in the world, or the farthest reaching. Their sound can travel about a mile away. And certain years when the Ocotea monteverdensis is like going off, there are like three-wattled bellbirds basically everywhere. And it is a really iconic sound in March, basically when they start arriving, and they basically call out for females to mate with, and it's only the adult males that get this kind of white and chestnut coloration with these wattles. This is all for sexual selection. And I threw on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen what's called the bellbird biological corridor, which is basically where the bellbirds are moving to and from. And it's important because, like I talked about, from international species and long distance migration, it's important to conserve habitat across ecosystems and across political boundaries. And the same thing is true, but on a smaller scale here in Costa Rica. And so there's conservation efforts to reforest a lot of the areas in this area, which have been deforested for cattle grazing and things like that. And this is really a very small area of the country. To get from Guasimal to Monteverde by road is about an hour in the car. So you can see that it's a really small amount of land, but it's really critical for the bellbirds. Here's another shot of an adult male bellbird. All right, getting into mannequins. So there's quite a few mannequins. I'm going to go through them. They are lekking birds for the most part. Males perform in groups to attract females through singing and dancing, and they often display cooperatively. And the red-capped mannequin is no exception. This is like the Michael Jackson bird, and it has one of its display moves is like this kind of moonwalk. And I encourage you to check it out on YouTube. Just YouTube red-capped mannequin Michael Jackson dance, and you will for sure have your mind blown if you haven't already seen it in a nature documentary. Alrighty, Bacards and Tatiras, they're there. Tyrant flycatchers, 20% of the birds in the New World tropics are flycatchers. And that's because there is such a high diversity of insects in the country that over time, these species have been able to specialize in different groups of insects or different types of insects. And you can see between these kind of relatively similar flycatchers, they have quite different sized beaks and some different plumage, and the beak and the overall size and kind of where you find the bird positioned, in the vertical strata also kind of indicates what type of insects they like to consume. This is a very fancy flycatcher. This is the long-tailed tyrant. This is like the fanciness that the black phoebe wishes it could have. Alrighty. Thrushes. Some thrushes are passage migrants, and some of them are overwintering residents, and some of them are year-round residents. This is the orange-billed nightingale thrush. There's maybe 4 or 5 different nightingale thrushes in the country, each with kind of their own different ranges. A couple of them have ranges that overlap, but they're really, really cool. Alrighty, silky flycatchers. These are technically flycatchers, but they're actually more frugivorous, feeding on berries in highland altitudes or in highland habitats, as opposed to insects. If you've ever seen a phainopepla or heard of a phainopepla, these guys are in the same family. There's, I believe, four silky flycatchers, different species in the Western Hemisphere. Here's two of them, and we look for them both on the Central Sewer Tour. And wrens. There are so many wrens in Costa Rica. They are challenging to differentiate sometimes because they sound similar. But we're going to keep moving on into warblers, and then here's a resident. This is a slate-throated redstart, and here's another resident. This is a collared redstart. There's a lot of warblers that move through Costa Rica, neotropical migrants. And then this is a resident yellow warbler. These guys are found in mangrove habitats. You can see some like on South Padre Island in South Texas, but not really common in the United States. But these guys are really beautiful. As you can see, it's basically a yellow warbler, but its head was dipped in chestnut and it's chomping on a caterpillar. Here's I believe a Costa Rican endemic or a Talamancan endemic. This is the flame-throated warbler. These are a highland bird from Talamancas. New World sparrows, they've got them. Some of them are quite handsome, like this white-eared ground sparrow. This is a rufous collared sparrow. This is probably the most widespread but handsome sparrow of kind of mid to upper elevation habitats. Finches and euphonias. This is a group. Euphonias are a group that we don't obviously have in the United States, and they come in kind of a couple different colors. They have kind of blue and yellow style, like the scrub and the yellow-throated. And then there's this olive-backed euphonia, and then the elegant euphonia. Cardinals and grosbeaks. So we've got blue grosbeaks, hepatic tanagers, kind of more of highland habitat, summer tanagers, a winter resident, and then the bells of the ball for most folks, neotropical residential tanagers. So here's a bay-headed tanager. Here's the emerald tanager. This is kind of more of a Caribbean species. This is one of my favorite tanagers. Here's the golden hooded tanager. These guys are relatively common in kind of mid to low elevation habitats with Caribbean influence, and they often show up in gardens and edge habitat, and they're just stunning. Here's a spangled cheek tanager. This is a really hard bird to see well because it's often up in the cloud forest where lighting is low and there's clouds and mist and really dense foliage and things making it challenging to take a good photo. But they are absolutely stunning birds, and they don't usually cruise around in flocks of spangled cheek tanagers, but they sometimes can be spotted accompanying mixed flocks, which are mixed groups of birds that travel through the forest together, searching for food and offering each other protection in the way of more eyes to look out for predators. Here's a scarlet rump tanager, and a very similar but dramatic crimson collared tanager. This is also more of a Caribbean tanager species. Banana kit. If you spent any time in the tropics, there's a good chance you've seen a banana kit. Technically, I think they're tanagers, but they're more of nectar robbers, and they'll pierce the corolla or like the fleshy tubular part of the flower, and they'll sip the nectar without actually pollinating the flower. Keeping things going with tanagers, here's the silver-throated tanager, just in good light. They are unbelievable. Here's another stunner, this speckled tanager. This is a headshot, but basically the rest of the bird continues with this unbelievable pattern. Here's a buff-throated saltator. We have a couple different saltator species, cinnamon-bellied, black-throated, etc. These guys are real common at fruit feeder setups, and yeah, they're kind of like a mix between like a jacked up sparrow and a tanager. Here's one of my fan favorites, the red-legged honey creeper. This is an adult male with its red high heels on and its kind of seafoam green cap and this uniquely shaped beak for foraging for nectar as well as fruits. And green honey creeper, super widespread honey creeper species in the New World tropics. And getting into some of the finches, this is a Nicaraguan seed finch. This is only this bird's only found in the northernmost part of the country, like Caño Negro and the lowlands. And then we have a couple family members from the icterid family, like red-breasted meadowlark, and the Bullock's oriole is a common neotropical migrant. Montezuma oropendula is one of a couple different oropendulas. These guys build nests in large hanging sacks, kind of like orb weavers, um, or weaver birds, but they roost and nest colonially. I think that's the right word. Communally, they have a bunch of hanging nests from a tree, and they are a sound you will never forget in the tropics. And it's not just the birds that are fantastic in Costa Rica. Of course, like I said, ecotourism has been really stable and safe in Costa Rica for a long time. And so there have been some significant developments in terms of lodges and things like that. Arnall Observatory Lodge is a spot that we stay on my northern tour, and it is probably one of the most premier lodges in the country for good reason. Lake Arnall and Arnall volcano, and just tons and tons of gorgeous birds here. Here's Paritzo Quetzal Lodge, which is where we stay on the Central Shore Tour when we're looking for birds in the Talamanca Highlands. And Dante Corcovado Lodge. This is a really cool lodge in the kind of Central Sur area close to the Osa Peninsula. Alrighty. Oh yeah, here's one more from Hotel Villalacpas, which is another cool spot. And this is what I was talking about, where the Nicaraguan seed finch can be seen in this kind of Caño Negro area. And this is a big stop on my northern tour up to in the northern region of Costa Rica, and looking for a bunch of different birds here: pinnated bittern, agami heron, yellow-breasted crake, etc., etc. All right, I think that's all I have for y'all. That was about an hour of me talking. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and maybe there's some questions.
Thank you, Benny. Kind of exciting there, I tell you. A lot of places to go. Uh, you know, so folks, if you have some questions, please put them into the chat. While we're waiting, Benny, you mentioned the habitat efforts for the bellbird. What other birds that you spoke about tonight are in a situation where they need some extensive habitat monitoring and protection?
That's a good
I guess quite
question.
a few, maybe.
I think, well, the thing is, not all birds have such a unique lifestyle, I would say, and also such a limited range. Like the bellbird's so unique that it's an altitudinal migrant, and that it
Uh-huh.
doesn't really go to that many places in the country. And so I'd say that's probably like the prime case of it. But I mean, that's a really good question that I'll have to like do a little bit more research on in terms of what species are in decline. I think like there's definitely there's definitely some birds that just like typically have like low abundance in the country. They're just like not super populous. And then some that are very like very widespread and have a lot of different habitat that they can occupy. But I I'm gonna look that up, and I'm gonna ask around because I don't have like a specific answer off the top of my head, because some birds are just like super rare and just like very
Right.
challenging to find, but they're not necessarily like in need of like direct conservation efforts beyond just like general habitat conservation.
Hmm.
So I'll look that up. That's a really good question.
Okay. Well, thanks. Uh, Diane would like to know what's the best time of year to visit. Not Diane, but Tanya. I mean, sorry.
Um,
Best time of year to
well,
visit.
I think it's personal preference. I'd say if you don't want rain, then the dry season, which is basically like November through April, is kind of the dry season, but that's also kind of the busy season. Costa Rica kind of turns off in the like in the rainy season because a lot less people come. But I think Costa Rica is fantastic year round. I'd say basically any month except for like September and October are good months to be there, because those are kind of typically the rainiest months. And
Mm.
sometimes roads can be like, sometimes travel can be significantly harder with that much rain, flooding, things like that. So I'd say pretty much anytime outside of September and October, you'd have a mind-blowing time for sure.
You mentioned fruit stations. I think lodges are pretty, I don't say notorious, but they're not shy of setting up feeding stations. Um, do you think that these birds coming to feeding station, um, does that make it harder to find them in the wild, in the field? If they live close to a lodge and they know there's going to be food.
That's a good question and something that I thought about a lot. And the short answer is no. And sometimes it's actually the opposite because they'll like feeder activity is generally the highest when fruits aren't like when trees aren't fruiting. And so
Okay,
when the forest is like going off with like natural food and fruits and things like that, a lot of like feeder activity, like the feeders aren't good. But during like parts of the dry season and things like that, when fruit is more scarce, the feeders can like blow up in terms of like just so many birds coming to them. And there are some instances like in tropical places where not necessarily a like a fruit feeding platform, but like I don't know if you've heard of like in countries like in Ecuador and Colombia, and there's ant pitta feeding stations where people have, I wouldn't say tamed, but they've trained ant pittas to like come to the sound of a voice or to a certain sonation, and then they put out worms on a little like mossy log, and then the ant pittas come and eat the worms. And so in those cases, those are sometimes like the only ways to see certain ant pittas, and because they're just like super furtive and extremely challenging to locate visually. You can hear them, but to see them is like a whole different beast. And this is kind of a relatively new um development in terms of like avatourism, and I think it has positive benefits from kind of like an ecotourism perspective because it allows people who maybe wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to offer bird watching tours and provide experiences to people that are visiting for a short period of time to see some of these like super unique species. Like in
yeah,
Ecuador, there's a spot where you can see like five different, and the takeaway there is that in the spot in Ecuador called Angel Paz, he and his family have been like they were formerly like farmers and ranchers, and they got into birds, and his property that he was doing his tours on, where you can see like up to five ant pitta species, was going to be subdivided and split up amongst like his siblings because his mother had died. And so like the land was going to go to like all of them to decide what to do with it. But like only a couple of the siblings wanted to like continue to like use the land and conserve it and not like turn it into cattle ranching. And so like over the several many years that Angel Paz and his family have been running birding ecotourism there, they were able to set up a fundraiser to cover the rest of the cost to purchase the land and conserve it. So, there are some like definitely like I would say negative impacts, I'd say, to like
uh-huh.
bird feeding. But I'd say like the ecotourism benefits and the money that those things bring to conserve habitat in the country, I think are, I don't know if they outweigh them, but they definitely contribute like pretty significantly to bird conservation in the tropics.
Uh-huh. Okay, makes some sense. Yeah, and I have heard of the ant pita feeding uh, uh, habits of ecotourist operators. And yeah, if people are going to, people can see that, come back, they'll spread the word. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be, a lot of indirect benefit for everyone. I don't know about the animal, but for humans at least. Um, so we have a question. Oh, okay. So Diana asked, what is we're talking about feeders, caring about feeders. What is the status of feeders? Last year, they were apparently being discouraged at places like La Paz. Um, have you
Yeah, so it's a
heard
good,
anything about that?
yeah, yeah. So CNAC is basically, so this is because it's kind of a contentious topic because not everybody thinks that they should be doing it and birds should be like getting natural food from their environment, which
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree. And so in certain places, they technically feeding is prohibited, I think, in the country, but there's such little enforcement of anything like that some places that are maybe less on the radar still do that because of
Right.
like the ecotourism benefits that they incur. And then there's other places that are like totally in the spotlight that that have taken down their feeders. So like there's a spot in Monteverde called Curicancha, and in the past they had hummingbird feeders, and SINAC was like, hey, you guys need to take down your hummingbird feeders. And like it's not an easy thing to ask an ecotour like an avitourism operation to take down
Hmm.
feeders because there's like a ton of revenue that comes from that. And like a ton, I don't mean like millions of dollars, but like it has a serious impact on the economic livelihood of the families that work there and run the lodges and stations and things like that. But instead what they did was they planted an entire like maze of like flat purple flowering plants, like hedges and things like that. So there
Uh-huh.
are other ways to like encourage birds to feed in areas where people can observe them. But obviously, like probably from a purist standpoint, the best thing is to just restore habitat to include native and low and regionally appropriate species
Yeah.
to support bird life in general.
Right. I guess some of the same thoughts are happening up here.
Yeah,
Okay. All right, folks. If there's any last questions about like last call on questions, okay. Oh, here's stuff.
that was me.
Oh, that's a long question. No, yeah, basically, yes. I want to thank you uh, for taking us on this tour, um, and it was very interesting. The places that you talked about, and the different elevations and the different habitats, uh, was enough to get you. I think one could go out and look at some of this stuff up and further, this educational starter you brought to us tonight. So thank you very much for taking the time to give us such a great talk. And
Thank
we've
you
got a
so
lot of
much, Ken. I
people
really appreciate it.
thanking you in here. Yeah, you bet.
Thanks,
So,
everybody. Yeah, thanks
all
y'all
right, folks.
for coming
Go ahead.
out.
I'm
Super
sorry,
appreciate
Benny.
it. No, no, I was just saying thanks everybody for tuning in, and maybe next time we'll get to meet in person because I think it's way more fun.
Yeah, yeah. And folks, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really do appreciate it. And have a good rest of your evening. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.